Okay, so just the technical summary is that this discourse has 4 sections, I believe, or it's 3, and the third one is divided into 2. We're middle of the third. Last week, Bob asked the question of where are we going? In other words, and this vision that this discourse lays out, what's the future? And it's interesting that the final section of this discourse is the answer to that question of where we're going and how is that different from where we were. So we'll get to that in a moment. But to begin with, the big picture is we start section 1. We start talking about understanding or knowledge or seeing, all synonyms for the aspects of godliness that we could relate to or we could see. We can understand, but more than understand, we can actually see it in the sense we could see its effect. And that's the aspects of godliness invested within creation. And for that, you don't need faith. In other words, faith is not necessary. Then we go to in section 2, we talk about what is faith. So faith is something that we connect to the infinity of God, the transcendence of God in the language of the Kabbalah. Soivev Kalam, and the light that encompasses and surrounds all the worlds. We say surrounding, not because it's not inside, but because it's too great for our senses to grasp. So it's sort of above, hovering above. And that was the second aspect. So you have the understanding in the aspects of God that can be understood. You can relate and sense God, just like you sense that you have a soul within your body because you see that your body is alive. So you could sense that the universe is alive. And then you have the faith in the transcendence. That was section 1 and section 2. Then we move to section 3. Section 3 is the purpose to grow is what we really purpose of Judaism from this perspective is actually to invest more of the infinity into the finite. In other words, the transcendent aspects of God should be felt within finite reality. And in some ways, what that would be is connecting the two, bringing what he called the understanding into the earth. We got into this whole thing of why faith is earth, because on one hand, it's the lowest, on one hand, it's the highest. Let's put that aside for a second. And then we continued and said, how do you do that? How do you bring the infinity into the finite? Or in the language of the Kabbalah, how do you bring Soivev, the light that encompasses the worlds? How do you bring it into what we would call Memale, the limited light that's invested within the world? Or how do you bring the faith into the knowledge? In other words, how do you feel connected to the infinity? So for that, the only tool is to follow the manual that God lays out, and that's the Torah, and that's the purpose of the Torah and the mitzvot. And we said, generally speaking, they could divide the service of God into 3 columns. Right column is chesed, kindness, drawing Hashem down into this world. That is generally accomplished through all the commandments, but specifically commandments like charity, because the idea of charity is giving from your kindness to others. So the kindness is sort of flowing downward. That's the infinity of Hashem flowing into this world. Then you have the idea of prayer, and prayer is the opposite. It's not bringing Hashem down, but it's elevating myself. In the temple, you had the visual of the symbol of the offerings literally going up in the smoke and the fire, and fire surges upward. Today, we don't have the temple, we don't have the physical offerings, but we have prayer, and prayer is in place of offerings. But what we're doing in the prayer, and that's why we have so many pages, because we're actually building the bonfire. We're building the fire. We're exciting our heart with a passion to come close to Hashem. That's flowing upward. And then we're going to talk about the middle column, which is Torah, which is discovering that the empathy, so to speak, that's what we did elaborate upon last week, but sensing that essentially the deeper truth is that we are one with God. And that's sort of the middle column, because it's not going up, it's not going down. It's discovering the deeper truth that we're actually bound up all the time. It's just beneath the surface. So that's really the summary up to this point. We're going to come back to the verses now, which is going back to a context of Shema Yisrael, when Hashem, when the discourse began, when that was saying Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, seemingly that is something that's related to everywhere, and yet Moshe says it's as a preparation of entering the land that flows with milk and honey. So we want to explain the mystical element of Shema and explain how the metaphoric land of Israel is associated with that theme. So that's a little bit of the summary. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Just a clarification, clearly these are allegorical of the three patriarchs, the Chesed, the Gvura, and the Tiferet. Now, it always seems to me that Tiferet is the best, and that if you were going to put it on some kind of grade, Tiferet is the synthesis. But
Yeah.
I never get the impression that, at least in describing the patriarchs, that Yaakov is the best. So are we to assume that these three pillars are equal to each other and, equal in terms of benefit to us, or are we synthesizing towards the middle ground, Torah and Tiferet?
I think that you asked a very good question. The word best is a tricky word because it could mean different things. Certainly the Kabbalah, but even the Talmud says that Jacob, Yaakov, is the muvchar. Muvchar could be chosen of the three. It could also be the choicest. So in other words, in some ways, it's the best. Now, if you look at the simple story, you see in what way is Jacob the best? Abraham seems to be sort of the pioneer. Isaac is in his own way, is very intensely connected to Hashem, probably the most spiritual of the patriarchs. He's going up, he's Gevurah. Jacob seems like a guy, probably seems like the most ordinary of the patriarchs in some ways, full of struggle. Doesn't seem like to be so extraordinary. So why are we saying that he's the choicest of the three? Or where do you see that in the story? So there are different answers to that question, but the most straightforward answer, I would say, is in some ways he's the best. Look at Jacob, look at his success rate with all of his children. Now, his children weren't perfect. They got into some trouble. They sell the brother as a slave, granted. But if you think about the track record of Abraham and Isaac, both of them were very successful with one child, but the other child, or in the case of Abraham, multiple children, are not part of his legacy. Now, why is that? Why is it that Jacob can get through the most essential question of identity? How his children identify as what's there with their mission? So why is it that Jacob could be successful with everybody and Abraham and Isaac cannot? Does it mean that Jacob is better? Or they're somehow, like I said, Isaac has a very bad success rate, a 50% success rate. It's not great. So the Kabbalistic answer is that both Abraham and Isaac are one-dimensional. And if you're one-dimensional, you're not going to get through to all your children because some children are going to relate to that aspect of your personality, your spiritual personality. And the other children simply will not. They don't speak that language. They're not inspired in that same way. So Abraham can't get through to Ishmael. Isaac can't get through to Esau. Jacob, because he's the synthesis, so he can really connect to his children, or his children could connect to him. They see themselves within him. And in that sense, he's the choicest, and you see it in the story, that he's the most successful in communicating his way of life. Now, mystically speaking, there's no question that Tiferet is the greatest. The middle column goes up all the way to the Keter, to the crown. Right and left don't go to crown directly. The middle column goes the highest and descends the lowest. So on Kabbalah, you're certainly in good ground that the middle column, Jacob, is the best. But I'm trying to say that even in the simple story, Jacob is successful in the most important mission of his life. In other words, perpetuating his legacy. Now, question is, can you get to 3 without 1 and 2? Probably not. Right? To have the synthesis, you have to first have. Otherwise, you start with 3. Why do you have to have 1 and 2? Because to be able to create the synthesis between things that are so different and apart, between heaven and earth, you have to first figure out how to bring Hashem down. You have to figure out how to elevate yourself. Then, once you experience those ideas, then you could see the deeper truth and understand that from a certain perspective, we're deeply connected at the core. But there's no shortcuts. So in other words, you cannot get to Jacob without experiencing Abraham and Isaac. And then you can get to the middle column. So I'm not saying Jacob is he better than the other two? I don't know if better is the right word, but he certainly has certain advantages, not because he's so great, perhaps because he follows Abraham and Isaac's footsteps. So he benefits from their perspective and from their and from the spiritual path that they paved. So that's what I would say.
So are we to assume that what we're talking about today is the same, that when we're dealing with Chesed and Gvura, that the Tiferet in the middle Torah is what we're aspiring to?
In some sense, yes. However, the sages say same thing. You can't have Torah without prayer. You can't have prayer without Torah, without good deeds. So good deeds is the Chesed. Prayer is the Gvura. Kol omer ein li Torah, afilu Torah ein lo. Somebody who says, I only have Torah, meaning I'm not so interested in the good deeds, acts of kindness, then we say, even Torah you don't have, because in some sense you missed the boat, because in some sense you can't get to the middle without first going 1 and 2. You can't just jump to step number 3. So if you have kindness and you're flowing outward and you're bringing Hashem's light into your life, because remember, Hashem, this is a very powerful concept that the Kabbalah introduces. So personally, I take this for granted, but this is very radical, that Hashem's interaction with the world is commensurate with the way we act. So when you perform an act of kindness, what that does is triggers that Hashem would reciprocate, and Hashem also acts in an act of kindness. Now, it doesn't just mean that he gives you blessing and that you have health and you have money in your bank account, but it also means that Hashem allows some of this spiritual energy to flow into this world, and you then can feel connected to Hashem. So then when you study Torah, you sense that you're not just studying about a cow that gored another cow, which is interesting, but you sense that this is Hashem's wisdom. Okay, so that has to come after the concept of kindness and prayer and prayer. And prayer has to come after kindness. It says in the Code of Law, and it comes from a verse from King David, Ani b'tzedek echzeh panecha, I will meet your countenance with righteousness. So the Talmud interprets that verse to mean that before you pray, you have to give charity. And Kabbalistically, it works very well. So you have to first is chesed, first is charity, then is the prayer, which is the gvura, which is the going up, and then after you study, the Talmud says, "Mi beit hakneset lebeit hamedrash." From the synagogue, you go to the study hall. Now, it doesn't just mean geographically, but it means that's the order. After you pray, after you pray, you study a little bit. Now, even if you don't go to a formal class, today already built into the prayer is certain aspects of study, right? So you have, we say, certain Mishnahs at the end of the prayer before Aleinu. So we have that built into the system. But you see that model today, that in some sense Torah is the greatest, but that doesn't mean that you can bypass the first two. So that's what I would say. Okay, so let's go back to the discourse. We'll read a little bit and we'll see how far we can get, and we'll so the end of 3 is a reiteration of what we said, applying it to the verses. I'll try to get by this relatively quickly, and then 4 is where are we going with this? What's the ultimate purpose of this of the world in the context of this conversation of the infinite light and the finite light, and what have we already achieved or already experienced at Sinai, and what yet remains to yet to be achieved in the future. So that's where. But when I looked at it last Shabbos, and as soon as we got off the call, and I said, "Start thinking about the rest of the discourse," and I said, "Boom! That was Bob's question. Where are we going with this?" So that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman seeks to answer in number 4. Okay, so I'm right now in the middle of 3. I think I shared the screen, right? And here we go. We're going back to the verses, the opening questions of the discourse, and they were that Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, is a continuation to what it says that Hashem now is giving you a land that flows with milk and honey. And the question Rabbi Shneur Zalman asked is, seemingly, there's 2 types of mitzvot. There are mitzvot that are upon the person, the body. And then there are the mitzvot that are upon the land. And mitzvot of the land are applicable specifically in Israel, whereas mitzvot upon the person are applicable everywhere. So, for example, Shemitah, the sabbatical year, only applies in the land of Israel, not outside of Israel, because the mitzvah is upon the land. The land should rest. On the other hand, Shema, love of Hashem, or belief in Hashem, or knowledge of Hashem, this has nothing to do with the land. This applies everywhere. That's why, indeed, the mitzvah of the Shema is everywhere, even outside of Israel. So why is it that the verse connects the Shema with the land of Israel? And we already have the ingredients of the answer. We already know enough of the mystical interpretation to explain the answer, because again, land is the metaphorical meaning of land would be faith, as we mentioned earlier. We're going to reiterate this today. We'll see how fast we can get by this. Here we go. Now, the idea of the passage Shema Yisrael is as follows. So what we're going to explain is as follows, that in Shema, you have two names of Hashem, right? Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel. Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord is our God. Okay? There's two names. Why are there two names? So the Kabbalah is going to tell you there are two names because there's two separate concepts here. You have Hashem. Hashem is the transcendent name of God. Where do you see that? The name of Hashem comes from the word Hayah, Hoveh, V'Yihiyeh, past, present, and future, all bound into one. So essentially what we're saying when you say the word Hashem is that you're saying that Hashem is the transcendent God, the Hashem, the infinite God that's above time and space. And then Elokeinu is already a name that's associated with creation, associated with nature. In fact, if you look at the 6 days of creation, it just says Elokim. It doesn't say the name Hashem. Hashem is only introduced on Shabbat, on the seventh day. And the sages already state that the word Elokim has the numerical value of Hateva, nature. So you have Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel. What's the message? Hashem Elokeinu. There's the infinite light of Hashem, and then there's the finite expression of Hashem's creative power. That's Hashem Elokeinu. And then the point is, could you connect the two? And that's what we're getting at right now. So let's read a little bit and we'll see what happens. So he says like this. So what is the idea of Shema Yisrael in the mystical sense? So that Hashem, as he is called Havaya, the word Yud Kei Vav Kei, the 4 letters that create Hashem's essential name, the Kabbalists changed the order because you can't say the name. When the root is Havaya, which could either mean to create, but it could to existence, that he's the true existence, or it could, like I said, it means past, present, and future. But in any case, in this context, it refers to Soivev Kalalmin, the light that encompasses the worlds. In other words, the infinity of God. He is our God, that's Elokeinu, meaning that we believe in him with only a simple faith. We want him to be revealed as Echad, as one. Now the Talmud explains, so we're taking a Talmudic idea. The word Echad is made up of 3 letters, namely the letter Aleph, showing that he is Aluf, the master. So the Aleph of Echad means Hashem is the master. Chet, which equals 8, refers to the 7 heavens and the earth. That's a Talmudic concept. There are 7 heavens and then there's the earth. And Daled, which equals 4, represents the 4 directions. What are we saying? We're saying we want this, the awareness of Hashem, who is Soivev Kalalmin, the infinity of God that surrounds the worlds, to be known and felt, so that we should be truly experience the fact that we have no existence whatsoever other than that we are part of Hashem's true unity. Through fulfilling the mitzvot, this awareness is created and drawn down into our faith, which is referred to as Eretz, earth. Okay, so now we say we want to bring the Shema into the earth. We already explained earlier in section, I don't remember what section was, I think it was may have been section 3, beginning of section 3. We already explained earlier that earth represents faith because in some sense, the simple faith is the lowest concept. It's beneath intelligence. On the other hand, it is also rooted in the highest, because with the intelligence, there's a cap of how much you could reach. How far could I reach? Only as far as I can understand. But with faith, because it's below intelligence, there's no limit of how high you can grasp. You can grasp the essence of God. But in any case, going back to our discussion, what is Shema? Shema is sensing that Hashem, the transcendent God, should be felt, Echad, should be felt in the Chet and the Daled, in the world, in the 7 heavens and earth, and in all 4 directions. So really it's 6 directions, up, down, and all 4 directions, because the Chet is 7 heavens and earth, that's up and down, then you have 4 directions. The point here is, the idea of the Shema is, we want to bring the awareness of the infinite light of Hashem into our finite reality, into the earth. And now he explains the concept of milk and honey. And milk and honey represents the land of milk and honey represents drawing down this infinite light. How so? So let's see, because we know Israel is a land of milk and honey. So if Israel is faith, then what is milk and honey related to faith? So let's see. So he continues and he says as follows: this faith that is permeated with the awareness of Hashem is often called Eretz, the land, faith that flows with milk and honey. Milk represents the ability to develop one's emotions, just as milk helps a baby grow and develop. This means that the love of Hashem that is hidden in our hearts should be developed and revealed from its potential to an actual feeling of love. This is Rabbi Shneur Zalman's grandson, Tzemach Tzedek, adds a note here, and he says, true development of our divine emotions is only derived from our belief in Hashem as he is Sovev Kol Almin, whereas from the level of how Hashem is Mamaleh Kol Almin, permeates all worlds, and unlimited love and fear for Hashem will not be produced. So what is he explaining? Let me just finish the point, and then finish the paragraph, and then and then we'll explain. So that's milk. What is honey? Honey represents sweetness and enjoyment, as it is written. Then you will have enjoyment from Hashem, meaning enjoyment from an awareness of how Hashem is Sovev Kol Almin, Hashem transcends the world. This means that when one will think about the idea that I, Hashem, have not changed, and you were the same before the world was created, and are the same after the world was created, and it is only his glory that is creating the heaven and earth, yet he raised the glory of his people, the children of Israel, the nation close to him, literally, then his heart will rejoice and exult that he will literally delight in Hashem. This is the meaning of a righteous person. Yichya will live through his faith. It's a verse in Chavakuk. We say it in the Haftarah of second day of Shavuot. The expression, I believe, I may be wrong, I think so. The expression Yichya will live is also an expression of enjoyment and expansion of the soul, as we find who create the blessing, who creates numerous souls and their needs, for all that you have created the Hachayot to give enjoyment through them to the soul of every living being. The meaning of Chesronam, their needs, is food and one needs for his life, that one needs for his life and existence. However, the next phrase, to give enjoyment through them to the soul of every living being, is referring to foods that are only for enjoyment and expansion of the soul. So too, a righteous person with his faith, Yichya, he will have enjoyment, since this faith will return his soul to him more than any other pleasures, even more than an abundance of all other good things. As it is written, who do I have in the heavens? And besides for you, Hashem, I do not want anything on earth. This is King David's book of Psalms. That we just finished section 3. We'll begin section 4 either in a few minutes or tomorrow or next week. But let's do a quick summary. What did we just say? We said as follows: you have milk and you have honey. Honey represents pleasure. That's the second point. We'll get back to that in a second. What is milk? Milk, in the imagery of in the context, milk is what the child needs to grow. In the Kabbalah, child is emotion. The father and mother is the intelligence, the awareness, and the analysis. Chachma and Bina, wisdom and understanding, is father and mother. Why are they called father and mother? Because they produce children. What is the children? Emotions. We have that in Tanya chapter 3. Your emotions are commensurate with your understanding, with your perspective. If you think this is good for you, you will be drawn to it. If you have a child who doesn't understand abstract concepts, he won't be drawn to it. So if you ask a child, what would you rather have? Would you rather have cotton candy or a trust fund? The child is going to say cotton candy, because he doesn't understand abstract concepts. The more the brain develops, the more you understand, then your emotions will also change corresponding to that. So parents are intelligence, children are emotions. Emotions are children. Now, if you say you need milk to make the emotions grow. So what we're saying here is, when you think about Hashem in the Mamaleh model, in other words, the limited level of godliness that creates the worlds. Okay, so you're in love with Hashem because Hashem is your life, but it's not going to increase. If you want to increase and intensify the intense love can only come from the idea that God is transcendent. So therefore, the drive to connect to God is greater than anything else you can imagine, because everything in this world is finite and Hashem is infinite. But in order to reach the state of intensified love, you have to go beyond the limited level of godliness in the world, and you want to connect to the infinity. And that's what we're saying. When you say the Shema, when you bring the awareness of God into the faith, in other words, you're making a marriage here between awareness of the infinity. What's going to happen is what follows is that represents milk. That means your emotion is going to be intensified. Your love of Hashem will be intensified. Because now, what do you love? You love what's desirous. What is God? Well, like I said, in the model of the Mamali, the light that fills the world, whatever it is, but it's limited. So limited love, limited godliness can only produce limited love. But if it's infinite godliness, then, and you could sense that, then there's nothing else that matters. Then you're like a person in love where everything else is insignificant in the face of their intense love. What the Song of Songs called Cholat Ahava, love sick. Maimonides explains, if you're love sick, just like when you're sick, you don't want anything. You can't eat, you can't drink, you can't do anything. So too, when somebody is love sick, if you talk about the true infinity of God, everything else is insignificant. So that's the idea of the milk. And then what is the model of honey? Honey is pleasure. And the same thing, pleasure. The taking pleasure in Hashem more than anything else can only come when you connect to the infinity of Hashem. And we concluded the section 3 with a verse from King David. And King David says, Mili bashamayim, I want nothing in heaven, and aside for you, I want nothing on earth. And that's what David says. I don't want, and even in heaven, I don't want anything other than Hashem. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the author of this discourse, would always quote that verse, and he would teach it. He would explain it in Yiddish, and he would say, King David is saying, I don't want your paradise. I don't want your lofty spiritual levels. I just want you, meaning the essence of God. In other words, the pleasure of connecting to the essence of God also is intensified when you connect to the infinity. And connecting to the infinity is the idea of the Shema. Because again, Shema is Hashem, the transcendent God. Bring it echad, bring it into the oneness. And again, oneness would mean, in the Talmudic interpretation, all 6 directions, 7 heavens and earth, and the four dimensions. So that's essentially what we said here. This is pretty much full circle of the verse. Now we're going to go back to the verses again, because we have one issue that we still have to explain. Well, a few issues, but one issue we're still going to explain is the difference between the verses. Sometimes it says you have been shown to know. In other words, we already have this awareness. And other places it says that you should know, which means you don't know it yet. So we're going to have to differentiate between what we already achieved in this regard and what is still left to be achieved in the future era. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Okay, it I think echoes a question I asked last week when listening to the late rabbi. When this is all beginning with the word Shema, listen, and this goes back to our original knowledge versus faith. Are we to assume that, and you say it 100 times, you paraphrase this whole sentence by just one word, Shema, listen. And the Song of Songs is a song, it's listening. It's counterintuitive for me to think that listening is better than seeing. So can you just elaborate a little bit why it's always about listening? Is it really the linchpin here is faith over knowledge? Is that why we listen? Or is there something else?
What I would say is that there's an advantage to each. There's an advantage to seeing and there's an advantage to hearing. The advantage to seeing is that it's more real to you. No matter what, abstraction, we're very visual, right? You can, as soon as the pictures of war start coming back to the press, people are against the war. We always knew people die in war. Doesn't matter. When you see a picture, is a visual, that's the nature of the human being. So if you could see something, you are affected in a very deep way. That's the advantage of sight. The disadvantage of sight is that the sight simply doesn't have the tools to pick up reality. Even forget about, we talk about you get to the atomic level, a subatomic level, even just light, right? The spectrum of light. The eye can only pick up a very limited level of the spectrum of light, very little amount of the spectrum. So sight is a wonderful tool, but sight is limiting. And if I would say that I only believe what I see, we talk about modern physics. modern physics, everything everything we have to think we can't see because it's completely counterintuitive to the way we process information. So hearing is more abstract, but it allows us to connect to phenomenon that our eyes simply cannot perceive. On the other hand, seeing has a certain advantage, and the advantage is that when you see something, it's real to you. That's why Judaism says, "Do not make any symbol." And Moshe says in this parsha Vayetchanan, the one we're studying now, do not make any symbol because you have not seen any symbol at Sinai. What's the danger of a symbol? You're going to say this is God. The problem is that God is infinite. God transcends any symbol. So yes, there's an advantage, and that's why every faith in the world will have a symbol. In other words, certainly pagan faiths to have a symbol because a symbol is very powerful. It makes an impression on people. But Judaism says we're not making any symbol because we have to hear. We can't see. Why? Because sight could never see infinity. Okay. On the other hand, so that's why we say Shema Yisrael, especially because we're saying Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem, and Hashem is the transcendent. We want to bring the transcendent into the oneness, into the world, because Echad is very interesting concept. We'll put that aside a second. It's not singular, it's one. It's a big difference. One represents this world. There's 7 heavens, there's earth, there's 4 directions. It's not singular. We don't say Hashem Yachid. Putting that aside a second, so you're saying Shema because we want listen because we want to connect to the infinity. On the other hand, even though Judaism says there's no symbols because the symbol is going to limit and there's no definitions of God. On the other hand, the verse we're quoting here from Job is that Job says, "Mi basari, from my flesh I see God." So there isn't a space for there is a place to incorporate the sense of sight in our relationship with God. With a caveat, you have to understand this is not God. You're seeing the effect of God, not God, the effect of God. So just like I don't see my soul, but I see the effect of my soul. I see that I'm alive. I see my heart is pumping. The guy next to me in the hospital, the heart stopped pumping. Mine is still pumping. So I see that I have life. I can't see the life, but I see the result of life. So the same thing, I could apply that to the connection to God and say, I don't see Hashem, but I see that the plant is growing. I see the bird is flying. I see life. So I'm seeing that. So in some sense, I'm seeing the soul of the universe, which is God. Now, to say that is God, it would be idolatry. If I say the leaf is God, it's idolatry. But if I say that the energy creating this leaf is from Hashem, and I'm seeing the result of that, I'm seeing that the effect of Hashem, that is something that Job says we should be doing. And certainly the Hasidic philosophy incorporates that into our service of Hashem. We sense God in nature. That's why the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and all the early Kabbalists, they all went out to nature because they felt close to God in nature. So they are seeing. On the other hand, that is not, there's no way you could see the infinity of God. For that, you would need the concept of Shema. You would need the concept of hearing, because hearing is the ability to think abstractly, to follow the mind, or in some cases, to follow faith. So that's right. What I would say about the word Shema.
And see, to me, not to be a gadfly, but to me, it doesn't give you the choice. It doesn't say Shema v're'eh Yisrael. And leaving out, I mean, if you look at the 5 senses medically, 60% is taken in through the eyes. So the fact that you're leaving out sight from your basic one line of a religion that defines the religion, I think is a big statement. I mean, it's basically saying, don't see.
But Bob, I want to comment, especially because it's this week. And tomorrow, we're going to read the Torah. And what's the opening statement of tomorrow's Torah portion? Re'eh. See, I place before you today blessing and curse. Why is Moshe saying see? Moshe is saying he's trying to paint it as something real. Now, you can't do that to God because God defies all description. God cannot be seen. But you see that Moshe himself is struggling to incorporate the concept of sight. It should be real to you as if you see it. You see Hashem placing before your blessing and curse. You don't see. Well, you see with the mind's eye. That's something that's already closer to our experience, that we could already see something physical and extrapolate that what's happening to us, the blessing and the curse, is a result of God's blessing. So, but Moshe is using that terminology as well, not to describe God. You cannot see God.
Right. But it seems that Hanan is the A team, Re'eh is the B team. There's much more of an emphasis in the Torah for listening,
Because,
than it is to seeing, for whatever reason. And I think that brings us back to faith
because we're dealing with something that is transcendent, that is infinite.
and abstract. Right.
As a student of Chabad, I have to push back because Chabad is the idea of Chachma Bina Dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And the distorts keep saying the idea is not so much, you have to start with faith and you have to believe in the transcendent, but could you bring some of that into the earth?
Got it. I get it. The dance.
God. Could you try to sense the infinity, which is really a paradox? And in some sense, the answer is you can't unless you follow the manual of Hashem, because the Torah and the mitzvot, you have to experience it. When you eat the matzah, because this is Hashem's will, Hashem could choose to infuse a feeling of that infinity into your consciousness. You can't achieve it on your own because we're limited creatures. But if we follow the roadmap, that we follow the manual that Hashem creates, and that's the mitzvah, that's what we started saying in the beginning of 3. You want to connect infinity to the finite, you have to, the toolbox is the Torah and the commandments, like we said, the right, left, and center. But so the point is here, if you want to connect to infinity, you have to connect on the terms of the infinity. And that's why it's a very interesting concept that a lot of spiritual seekers don't like Judaism. They don't like it because it doesn't make them feel spiritual. It's a lot of ritual and not enough spirituality. And they say, I feel closer to Hashem if I'm going to do whatever it is. Now, what is the intellectual, I don't want to say fallacy, but what is the intellectual perspective of Judaism? What Judaism would say is like this: look, if you want to feel close to God, maybe there are easier ways to feel close to God. But if you want to connect to infinity, there is no way a finite being can connect to infinity. It's impossible. The only way it could happen is the infinity chooses to show up at your door. Now, what God is saying, you want me to show up on your door, do A, B, and C, I'm going to show up at your door. So I always give the parable. The parable is that I want to meet you. So I say, I feel close to you when we're at the restaurant. That's where I feel close to you, because that's why I feel close to you. So I go to the restaurant and I feel very close to you. The problem is you're not in the restaurant, you're in the library. And you tell me you want to connect to me, come to the library. Yeah, but I feel closer to you in the restaurant. So the question is like this: if you're talking about infinity, if you want to connect to the infinity of God, the only way to do so is on Hashem's terms. And the point here is, but we can bring that into our consciousness when we follow the model that Hashem lays out. Now, I mentioned right, left, center, acts of kindness, acts of prayer, which is elevation. Kindness draws downward. Prayer goes upward, and Torah is the empathy, which is the same, which is to show that we sense that deep down we're one with the divine perspective. So the short answer, I don't know how we got here exactly. I went a little bit off track, but the short answer is that we're talking about the Shema because we're talking about infinity, but we have to bring it into our conscious mind, and that's Chabad. That's wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. That's seeing. In other words, there is a practice, and this discourse begins with this practice. Next time you go outside and you see the universe alive, you're supposed to see God. You're supposed to sense God. Just like when you see your hand is alive, you sense your soul. And that is an important spiritual exercise from Judaism's perspective, certainly from the perspective of Chabad. Why? You say, what do I care? I see the leaf. I believe in the infinity of God. Yeah, but Bob just told me that 60% of what we process is through the sight. So if you could see something and see that as an expression of the divine power, then that's going to make an impact on you, perhaps deeper than the knowledge, which has certain advantages, deeper than the faith, which has certain advantages because it connects to the infinity, but it has a disadvantage that it's too abstract. So the question is, could we connect the abstraction of the infinity to the reality that we perceive? And that's what we're saying. And what God is saying, what the Torah is saying is, in Israel it's easier. In Israel it's easier. Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying Israel doesn't mean Israel only physically. There's also the metaphoric Israel. What's the metaphoric Israel? The land. What is the land? The land is faith, as we discussed last week. And when you have that faith, you're going to have flowing with milk and honey, because milk means your emotional connection to God will be intensified, because you sense the infinity. If you sense the infinity, you will want nothing else. Everything else is completely insignificant. And your pleasure, dvash, honey, is pleasure. Your pleasure will be intensified because you're connecting to the infinity of God. So you have the physical Israel, which what Moshe is talking about. You have the metaphorical Israel, as we're explaining it here. But what happens in each of these places, the infinity of God could be sensed and processed to a degree within our consciousness. And then to answer Bob's question from last week, where are we going? So what we're going to say in number 4, I don't think we'll read it today. We'll say it for next week. Maybe we'll finish the discourse next week. And then we'll start preparing for Rosh Hashanah. We'll do a Rosh Hashanah discourse. But where we're getting with this is that right now, to sense the infinity is a struggle. And therefore, we don't always sense it. And therefore, in our process of service of Hashem and self-refinement, there are ups and downs. Because yes, we sense the infinity of God at Sinai to a degree, and different times in our life or in our day, we could sense it. But we're still in the realm of Memale, in the limited light of God, and therefore there's limitation, and therefore there are ups and downs. The Messianic era is the time where V'yadaita Hayom, you will sense the infinity of God always. And if you sense the infinity of God always, then there will be no more negativity, because negativity pales in comparison. And that's the mystical idea. That's the mystical interpretation of the vision of the prophets that you read all over the prophets, that there'll be no more, negativity or war or negative competition in the Messianic era. If the infinite light is present, the negativity is not attractive, and that's the correction of the universe. And he's going to elaborate and explain what I said last week from memory, but it's in this discourse that, ironically, the infinity could only be sensed in this physical earth, not in paradise, not in the spiritual sense. The highest and the lowest are connected. The infinity could be sensed in this physical earth. That's why it happens to the commandments, physical commandments. And that's why the Messianic era is played out. I think we mentioned this last week, the disagreement between Maimonides and Nachmanides. But from the perspective of Nachmanides and the Hasidic thinking, the ultimate purpose of perfection is, the vision is on this earth, because only on this earth could you really connect to the infinity. Why that is, we could talk about it now, or we could talk about next week. But in any case, comments, questions are welcome. So I don't think we advanced any new ideas here. We just sort of reiterated what we said earlier, and we put it in the context of the verses, and we explained the spiritual meaning of entering the land of Israel and the metaphorical land of Israel, which is bringing that awareness of the infinity of Hashem into the land, into bringing the awareness into the faith, connecting the faith of the infinity of God into our experience. So I think that's the big idea here. And like I said, we're going next week. Hopefully we'll finish next week. And that would be showing how up until now throughout history, this process has not been fully accomplished. And therefore there are ups and downs spiritually. And ultimately, we'll be able to sense the infinity of God within our consciousness. And at that point, that's where the correction of the world occurs. So thank you for joining, and thank you for listening. A wonderful Shabbos.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Doctor.